Sign it, Jessica, or we will file a petition in court to have you declared incompetent. Those were the words my son's wife used, right in my own living room, just weeks after my husband's funeral. My name is Jessica. To them, I was just a confused, grieving widow, an obstacle standing in the way of their $40 million inheritance. But they had no idea that the entire fortune they were fighting for didn't belong to them. It belonged to me, and it had for years. Their threat wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of their reckoning. Have you ever been completely underestimated by the people who should have known your strength? I would love to hear your story in the comments below. The silence in my house after Michael's funeral was a physical weight, heavier than any grief I'd ever known. For 40 years, these rooms had echoed with his booming laughter, the familiar sound of the Sunday football game on the television, the gentle rhythmic tapping of his keyboard from the study where he built his empire. Now, all that remained was a profound, hollow emptiness that the cloying scent of lilies and roses from dozens of sympathy bouquets couldn't begin to fill. The quiet was a shroud I had wrapped myself in for a week, a necessary buffer against a world that had lost its vibrant color. It wasn't until my son, Ethan, and his wife Juliet walked in, their presence sharp and intrusive, that I realized silence was a blessing compared to what was coming. They arrived under the well-worn pretense of checking in, their car, a sleek new German sedan I knew they couldn't possibly afford on Ethan's salary, pulling silently into the driveway. Juliet swept in first, all sharp angles and a practiced, somber expression that looked alien on her usually smug face. She placed a professionally arranged basket of overpriced muffins on the granite kitchen counter, a space where I had taught her how to roll out pie crust years ago. Ethan followed her like a shadow, his broad shoulders slumped, his eyes steadfastly avoiding mine as he mumbled a greeting to the floor. He looked like a stranger in the very home where he'd learned to walk, a ghost haunting the edges of his own past. "How are you holding up, Jessica?" Juliet asked, her voice a little too bright, a little too polished for a house of mourning. She performed a slow, deliberate scan of the living room, her gaze lingering not on the family photographs crowding the mantelpiece, but on the high ceilings, the crown molding, and the wide plank hardwood floors Michael had painstakingly refinished himself. "This is such a big house," she continued, her tone laced with a concern that felt entirely manufactured. "It must be so much to manage for one person." The comment hung in the air between us, a carefully placed probe designed to test the waters. I gripped my warm mug of Earl Grey tea, the familiar ceramic a small, solid anchor in a suddenly turbulent sea. "It's my home, Juliet," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's full of memories." "Of course," she conceded quickly, her smile not quite reaching her calculating eyes. "But memories don't dust the furniture or pay the heating bills, do they?" It was a cold, pragmatic sentiment, one that laid bare the vast chasm between her worldview and mine. While I was enveloped in the warm, intangible embrace of the past, she was already calculating future liabilities. Later, while Ethan was pacing in the garden, speaking in low, hushed tones on his cell phone, I found Juliet in Michael's study. She was sifting through a neat stack of papers on his antique mahogany desk. "Just trying to help you get organized," she offered without looking up, a perfect picture of helpful efficiency. "There's so much to sort through. Did Michael have a comprehensive life insurance policy? What about his 401k? We need to understand the liquidity of the estate." Her questions were rapid fire, clinical, devoid of the gentle hesitation that true sympathy would afford. She spoke of my husband's life as if it were a balance sheet to be reconciled, a collection of assets to be cataloged and assessed. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp October air wafting through the open window. "Juliet, it's a little soon to be discussing these things, don't you think?" She had the grace to look momentarily chastised, her hand stilling on a file marked "Private." but the glint in her eyes didn't soften. "I just worry about you, Jessica. We need to have a proper family meeting soon to go over the estate. It's the only way to make things easier on you in the long run." Her repeated use of the word estate was jarring. Michael and I never thought of our life in such cold, impersonal terms. We had a home, savings, a life built on 40 years of love and hard work, not a portfolio of assets to be liquidated and distributed. As they prepared to leave, I walked them to the heavy oak front door. Ethan gave me a brief, awkward hug that felt more like a social formality than a genuine act of comfort. Juliet, however, paused at the threshold, turning back to me with a look of calculated sincerity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. "Michael would have wanted us to be practical, Jessica," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as if sharing a sacred confidence. "This house is a huge asset just sitting here." As they left, Ethan couldn't bring himself to meet my eye. He hurried to the passenger side of the car, leaving Juliet to close the door behind him with a soft, final click. In that moment, watching his retreating back, I felt a cold knot of certainty form in my stomach. This visit wasn't about helping me through my grief. This was about something else entirely. As I turned and locked the door, my gaze fell upon the mantelpiece, to a heavy, silver-framed photo of Michael standing beside his younger brother, a wide, genuine grin stretching across both their faces from a fishing trip years ago. "I know how much Dad trusted his brother," I murmured to the empty, oppressive room. "He always said Arthur was the only one who truly understood him." My home was no longer a sanctuary. Every room now felt like a future battlefield, and my memories were the territory they wanted to conquer. Juliet's parting words about the house being a huge asset had poisoned the air, turning the familiar scent of lemon polish and old books into something tainted. The days that followed were a blur of forced normalcy. I tended to my garden, I answered emails of condolence, but a sense of dread followed me from room to room. I found myself running my hand over the worn oak banister Michael had carved himself, the smooth wood cool beneath my palm. To them, it was a liability, a feature to be ripped out and replaced, but to me it was priceless. It was the last thing he had built with his own hands. The ambush came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the living room, the drone of a football game on the television, a low, comforting hum that reminded me of Michael. He had loved the sheer predictability of a midweek game. The doorbell rang, and I found Juliet on the doorstep, a bright, artificial smile plastered on her face. Beside her stood a man in a crisp, gray suit, holding a leather-bound clipboard. "Jessica, hi," Juliet chirped, breezing past me into the foyer. "This is a friend of mine, Mr. Davies. He's a real estate consultant. We were in the neighborhood looking at another property, and I thought it would be a perfect opportunity for him to give us an informal opinion. No pressure, of course." Ethan was right behind them, looking profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on a spot just over my shoulder. He knew this was a violation, a planned incursion, but he lacked the spine to stop it. My heart hardened. This wasn't a casual visit. This was a reconnaissance mission. "It's not a good time, Juliet," I said, my voice tight. "Oh, it'll only take a minute," she insisted, waving a dismissive hand as Mr. Davies was already peering into the dining room. "He has such a good eye. It's always smart to know what your assets are worth." The man, Davies, walked through my home with the cold, detached air of a surgeon examining a cadaver. He tapped on walls, scrutinized the plumbing fixtures in the guest bathroom, and made quiet, critical notes on his clipboard. In the kitchen, he ran a finger over the hand-painted Mexican tiles Michael and I had brought back from our 25th anniversary trip. "Dated," he announced, not to me, but to Juliet. "You'd have to gut the whole kitchen. Buyers want stainless steel and quartz countertops now." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Juliet agreed eagerly, as if they were co-conspirators in a home renovation show, "and the wallpaper in the hall is just terrible." That wallpaper, a soft floral pattern of climbing roses, was something Michael and I had spent an entire weekend putting up. We'd laughed as we struggled with the paste, getting more on ourselves than on the walls. It was a testament to our life together, imperfect, a little old-fashioned, but filled with love. "That's enough," I said, my voice quiet but ringing with an authority that surprised even me. "I think your friend has seen all he needs to see. I'd like you both to leave now." The air crackled with tension. Mr. Davies looked from me to Juliet, sensing he had overstepped. Ethan, who had been hovering uselessly by the doorway, finally spoke. "Mom, Juliet was just trying to help. We were just curious." "Curious?" I turned to my son, the last thread of my patience snapping. "You were curious about the price of my life's memories, Ethan? You were curious about how quickly you could erase your father from this house." He flinched, color rising in his cheeks. Juliet, however, was unfazed. She grabbed her purse, her expression turning from feigned concern to undisguised irritation. "Fine," she retorted, her voice sharp, "but you can't stop progress. Jessica, the market is hot right now, and we can't let your sentimentality cost us millions." The word "us" struck me like a physical blow. There was no us in this equation. There was only them and me. I stood my ground, silent until they were out the door. After they were gone, the house felt violated. The silence they left behind even heavier than before. As I began to straighten the cushions on the sofa they'd sat on, I saw it. The agent's business card left pointedly on the polished surface of the coffee table. I picked it up to throw it away, but froze when I saw the back. In Juliet's elegant, looping handwriting was a note. A chilling set of instructions meant for Ethan. "Full conservatorship petition, Dr. Albright." The legal papers weren't delivered by a courier. They were handed to me by my own son, his hand trembling slightly as he served me my first official notice of betrayal. The Sunday afternoon air in my living room was cold and formal, all pretense of a casual family visit stripped away. They had arrived with a chilling purpose, and the silence that settled after they closed the door was not one of peace, but of anticipation. Ethan wouldn't look at me, focusing instead on the thick sheaf of documents in his hands, while Juliet sat poised on the edge of Michael's favorite armchair, her posture radiating a triumphant confidence that made my skin crawl. "Mom, we need you to look at these," Ethan began, his voice strained as he pushed the papers across the coffee table. "It's for your own protection." I looked down at the top page. Bold letters spelled out, "Durable power of attorney." My breath caught in my throat. This was the endgame of their campaign, the culmination of all the whispers about my inability to manage, and the house being too much. "We've been worried sick about you since Dad passed," Juliet interjected, her voice dripping with a syrupy, false sympathy that was more insulting than open hostility. "Your emotional instability. It's understandable, but it makes you vulnerable. This document simply allows Ethan to handle your financial affairs, to pay your bills and manage the estate, so you don't have to worry about a thing." I stared at her, a cold resolve beginning to crystallize in my veins. "I have been paying my own bills for 70 years, Juliet. I think I can manage." She sighed, a theatrical display of patience wearing thin. "Jessica, it's not just the bills, it's the bigger picture. We've been speaking with a specialist, a wonderful psychiatrist who deals with issues of elderly cognitive decline." She paused for effect, letting the insult land. "He agrees that it's wise to have these protections in place." As she spoke, she casually slid a glossy brochure onto the table next to the legal documents. My eyes immediately locked onto the name printed in elegant script at the bottom. Dr. Robert Albright, Geriatric Psychiatry. It was the same name from the back of the real estate agent's business card. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. This wasn't a spontaneous concern, this was a coordinated attack, planned and researched with a chilling level of detail. They hadn't just found a doctor, they had an accomplice. "I am not signing these," I said, my voice low but firm. The shock that had paralyzed me was morphing into a protective anger. "Mom, please," Ethan pleaded, finally looking at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Don't make this difficult. We're just trying to take care of you. It's what Dad would have wanted." That was the deepest cut. Using Michael's memory to justify this monstrous act of betrayal was a desecration I couldn't bear. "Your father would have wanted you to respect me," I shot back, my voice shaking with the force of my conviction. "He would never have stood for this." Juliet stood up then, the mask of concern dropping completely from her face, revealing the cold, hard ambition beneath. She looked down at me, her expression one of utter contempt. "Sign it, Jessica," she said, her voice like ice, "or we will file a petition in court to have you declared incompetent. We have witnesses who will testify that you're losing your grip. It's your choice." The ultimatum, so nakedly hostile, hung in the silent room. They had everything planned: the fake concern, the complicit doctor, the witnesses they would undoubtedly bribe or manipulate. They had built a cage for me, and this document was the lock. I looked from Juliet's venomous expression to my son's weak, pleading face, and I knew I was utterly alone in this fight. Lying in bed that night, the threat hanging over me like a guillotine, I stared into the darkness, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Defeated, I felt the last of my fight draining away. But then, drifting up from the depths of my memory, I remembered Michael's last coherent words to me in the hospital, his voice a faint whisper, his grip weak on my hand. "If you're ever in a fight, you can't win alone," he had said, his eyes filled with a strange urgency. "Call Arthur. He holds the keys." Hope arrived not as a ray of light, but as a crackle on a long-distance phone call to a man I hadn't spoken to in over a year. After a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, the chilling echo of Juliet's ultimatum playing on a loop in my mind, I rose before the sun. The early morning light was a pale, watery gray, matching the washed-out feeling in my soul. I went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma strong and determined, a stark contrast to the fear coiling in my gut. As the coffee maker gurgled, Michael's last words echoed in my mind, a mantra against the encroaching despair. "If you're ever in a fight you can't win alone, call Arthur. He holds the keys." I didn't know what keys he meant, but right now it was the only lifeline I had. My hand trembled as I picked up the phone and punched in Arthur's number in Florida, my thumb hovering over the call button. For a moment I hesitated. What if Michael was just rambling? What if Arthur thought I was a hysterical old woman, just like Ethan and Juliet wanted me to be? But Juliet's threat to have me declared incompetent pushed me forward. I had no other choice. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff, sleep-roughened voice answered. "Yeah?" "Arthur, it's Jessica," I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of someone sitting up in bed. "Jess? It's 5 a.m. Is everything okay?" Tears I didn't know I had left began to well in my eyes. "No, Arthur, nothing is okay." With a ragged breath, I explained everything. I told him about the subtle pressure that had turned into a relentless campaign, the real estate agent, the constant suggestions that I move. My voice cracked as I described the scene from yesterday afternoon, the power of attorney documents laid out on my coffee table, the cold, triumphant look in Juliet's eyes. I told him about their threat to have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't sign everything over to them. I spoke for 10 minutes straight, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pain and fear. When I finished, the line was silent for a long, heavy moment. I could hear the faint sound of the ocean in the background of his Florida home, a world away from my cold, besieged reality. "Jess, Arthur began, his voice laced with a weary caution. Michael made me promise not to interfere unless it was a true emergency. He said you were a strong woman and that you could handle almost anything. His reluctance, though understandable, felt like a door slamming in my face. Arthur, this is an emergency, I pleaded, desperation creeping into my voice. My own son is trying to strip me of my home, my autonomy, my sanity. Juliet said they have witnesses who will testify that I'm losing my grip. They are going to put me away. That was the turning point. I heard a sharp intake of breath on his end, and when he spoke again, the weariness in his voice had been replaced by a cold, hard anger that mirrored my own. That conniving little snake, he growled, and I knew he was talking about Juliet. All right, Jess, I'm on the first flight out. Relief washed over me so intensely that I had to sit down. Thank you, Arthur. I didn't know who else to call. You did the right thing, he said, his voice now grim and focused. Michael saw this coming. He knew what Ethan was becoming, and he knew Juliet was a predator. He left something with me for you, a locked metal box. It's time you saw what's inside. A locked metal box. The keys. Michael's cryptic words suddenly began to make a terrifying kind of sense. He hadn't been preparing me for his death. He had been preparing me for the war that would follow. I'll be there tomorrow morning, Jessica, Arthur said, his voice a low, determined rumble before he hung up. Don't sign anything. Don't speak to them. We're going to war. The metal box Arthur placed on my dining room table wasn't large, but I knew it held a power vast enough to either save my life or shatter it completely. He had arrived that morning just as promised, his presence a solid, grounding force in a house that had begun to feel like it was floating away from me. We didn't waste time with small talk. We shared a brief, tight hug, a silent acknowledgement of our shared loss and the grim purpose of his visit, before he retrieved the gray, fireproof lockbox from his carry-on bag. The sunlight of a new day streamed in through the dining room windows, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny spotlight on the stage where my future was about to be decided. Michael gave this to me about a year before he passed, Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He told me it contained his real legacy. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a single old-fashioned brass key. My breath hitched. Then it was the same one I'd seen on Michael's keychain for years, a key that seemed to fit no lock in our house, a small, mundane mystery I had never bothered to solve. Now I understood. Arthur slid the key into the lock. The click of the mechanism turning was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He lifted the heavy lid, and we both peered inside. It was packed with manila folders, each one labeled in Michael's neat, architectural script. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and finality. Arthur, solemn and protective, simply nodded for me to begin, fulfilling his last duty to his brother. My hands trembled as I lifted out the first folder. The label read, Sterling Tech Inc., Ownership. Inside were not copies, but the original embossed stock certificates and a notarized deed of transfer. The legalese was dense, but the final lines were brutally clear. All shares, voting and non-voting, had been transferred to a single trust, and the sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust was listed as Jessica Hughes. The date of the transfer was May 14, 2020, 5 years ago. The next folder was thinner, labeled Ethan. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. It contained a detailed report from a private investigator. Page after page documented my son's life of reckless spending. Receipts from high-end Las Vegas casinos, bank statements showing massive withdrawals from the trust fund Michael had set up for him, and a summary of failed business ventures funded by shady, high-interest loans. He wasn't just irresponsible, he was financially drowning, and had been for years. At the very bottom of the box was a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name written on the front. I carefully broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in Michael's familiar hand. My dearest Jess, I read aloud, my voice cracking. If you are reading this, It means I'm gone. And worse, it means our son has forced your hand. For that, I am eternally sorry." Tears streamed down my face as I continued. I saw the change in him years ago, a hunger for things he didn't earn, and I saw the woman he chose, who fed that hunger instead of his soul. I couldn't bear to tell you my fears. I couldn't taint the love you have for our boy. So I did the only thing I could to protect you. I put everything in your name, legally and irrevocably, not as your inheritance, my love, but as your property, which it has been for years. It is yours to command, to grow, or to give away as you see fit. You are not the widow of a wealthy man, Jessica. You are a wealthy woman in your own right. The letter went on to detail his profound disappointment, his heartbreak over the son he felt he had lost long ago. He ended with a final chilling instruction. Use this power wisely, Jess. Not to hurt, but to protect yourself, and to teach a lesson that, God forgive me, I failed to instill myself. I placed the letter down, my whole body shaking with the force of the revelations. I looked again at the deed, at the official seal of the state of Connecticut, at the undeniable truth printed in black and white. "My God, Arthur," I whispered, the words catching in my throat as the full, staggering reality washed over me. It's been in my name since 2020. I own everything. In that exact moment, as the weight of this new power settled onto my shoulders, the doorbell chimed, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the sacred atmosphere in the room. I looked at Arthur, my eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He was already on his feet, moving toward the door. Through the beveled glass, I could see the silhouette of a courier in a crisp uniform, holding a thick, legal-sized envelope. Ethan and Juliet have officially filed the petition for conservatorship. The clock was now ticking. Holding the court summons in one hand and the deed to a $40 million company in the other, I finally understood the kind of battle Michael had prepared me for. The initial shock that had rendered me speechless was now solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. Arthur had handled the courier, his grim expression making it clear there was nothing to discuss. Now the official declaration of war lay on my dining room table, a stark white document full of baseless accusations, resting beside the papers that proved every one of them was a lie. This wasn't just a fight for a house anymore. It was a fight for my name, my sanity, and my husband's legacy. Arthur made the call, his voice low and serious, to a name Michael had included in his letter, Victoria Sterling. "She's the best," Michael had written, "and she's a shark. You'll need one." An hour later, we were sitting in a glass-walled conference room high above downtown Stamford. The office of Sterling and Associates was a world of cool steel, polished concrete, and panoramic city views, a place designed to convey unflinching power and competence. Victoria Sterling was the human embodiment of her office. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes, a no-nonsense demeanor, and a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. She listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, from the first veiled comments after the funeral to the official summons that now sat between us. Arthur sat steadfastly by my side, a silent, imposing guardian. When I finished, Victoria steepled her fingers, her expression unreadable. She had the professional skepticism of a lawyer who had heard 1,000 stories of family drama. Then I pushed the metal box across the table. "My husband called this his legacy box," I said. As she examined the contents, her professional mask began to crack. She reviewed the stock certificates first, her eyebrows rising slightly. She scanned the private investigator's report, her lips tightening into a thin, hard line. But it was the deed of transfer, with its official state seal and Michael's unmistakable signature, that made her pause. She held it up to the light, her skepticism melting into astonishment, then hardening into a fierce, determined focus. "My God," she said softly, looking at me with new eyes. "This isn't an inheritance dispute. This is an attempted hostile takeover." As she spoke, I recalled a conversation with Michael years ago. We were sitting on the porch, and he was complaining about a business partner's greedy children who were trying to force their father into early retirement. "You have to build firewalls, Jess," he'd said, swirling the ice in his glass. "Legal firewalls so high and so thick they can't burn them down." I never realized in that moment that he was building one for me. Victoria laid the documents out on the conference table, arranging them like a general mapping out a battlefield. "Their entire case," she began, her voice crisp and strategic, "is built on the premise that you are a mentally frail widow, incapable of managing your late husband's assets. They are going to commit perjury to prove it. They will bring in their hired gun psychiatrist. They will parade witnesses who will speak of your confusion and forgetfulness." She paused, looking directly at me. "And we are going to let them." Arthur and I exchanged a confused glance. Victoria leaned forward, a grim smile playing on her lips. "We don't show our hand, not yet. We don't reveal the deed, the PI report, any of it. We let them walk into that courtroom and build their mountain of lies under oath. We let them dig their own graves with their greed." The brilliance of the strategy was as terrifying as it was beautiful. She wasn't just planning to win, she was planning to annihilate them. "So what do?" I asked, feeling my role in this drama shift from victim to actress. "You, Mrs. Hughes," Victoria said, her eyes gleaming, "are going to give the performance of your life. You will be the frail, confused, grieving widow they so desperately want you to be. You will defer questions to your legal counsel. You will seem overwhelmed. You will let them believe they have already won." I took a deep breath. It was a daunting task, but after the last few weeks, I knew I had it in me. I would use their prejudice against me as my shield. Victoria smiled grimly. "A predator, sensing victory. They're trying to prove you're unfit to manage an estate that legally belongs to someone else, them. Their petition is based on a fraud. In legal terms, we call this a slam dunk. In personal terms," she added, her eyes meeting mine, "we call it poetic justice." She gathered her papers, her movements precise and final. The meeting was over. We stood to leave, a clear plan of action finally in place. But as we reached the door, Victoria's final advice was chilling, stopping me in my tracks. "From this moment on, you must assume they are recording you, every call, every conversation. Don't give them a single moment of clarity or strength to use against you. Let them hear only the woman they think you are. Use their own tactics against them." My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had been watching me from her window for 30 years, and it turned out she'd seen far more than just my gardening habits. In the quiet days that followed my meeting with Victoria Sterling, I fell into a strange, watchful calm, adhering strictly to my lawyer's chilling final advice. I played the part of the fragile widow, speaking to no one, assuming every shadow held a listener and every phone call was a trap. The war had begun, but my first moves had to be made in silence. It was on a crisp Saturday morning that I saw Eleanor Gable making her way across the lawn that separated our two houses, a determined look on her face and a plate of still warm scones in her hand. She had seen the legal courier arrive the day Michael's box was opened, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Jessica," she said, settling into a wicker chair on my front porch as I poured us both some tea. "I'm not one to pry, but I saw that man in a suit come and go, and you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. If you ever need to talk, you know I'm here." Looking at her kind, weathered face, I made a calculated decision. I needed allies, and Eleanor, with her fierce loyalty and neighborhood omniscience, was a powerful one. I didn't tell her everything, not about the deed or the full $40 million fortune, but I told her enough. I spoke of Ethan and Juliet's pressure to sell the house and their cruel attempt to have me declared incompetent. Eleanor listened, her expression growing harder with every word. When I finished, she set her teacup down with a firm click. "I knew it," she said, her voice a low hiss. I knew there was something wrong with that girl from day one. It was then I remembered a comment she'd made weeks ago, one I'd dismissed at the time. That wife of Ethan's has some very expensive taste in cars for a boy on an architect's salary. Eleanor, I began, you've noticed things. Her eyes narrowed. Jessica, I see everything. About 2 months back, I saw them meeting a man in a black SUV right at the end of our street. He was not a pleasant-looking fellow, looked like a loan shark straight out of a mob movie. They gave him a thick envelope, and he didn't look happy about it. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. I was worried, so I jotted down his license plate number. You never know. This was the first mini payoff, a piece of the puzzle that fit perfectly with the PI's report on Ethan's debts. They weren't just in financial trouble. They were involved with dangerous people. She wasn't finished. And that's not all. My son, Robert. You know he's a manager at the downtown branch of Connecticut Mutual? He told me months ago that Ethan's accounts are a disaster, maxed out credit cards, a second mortgage on their condo. He said they were living on fumes. It directly contradicts the wealthy, successful image they project to everyone. Every word she spoke was another nail in their coffin, another piece of evidence that their legal attack was born not of concern, but of pure, desperate greed. I felt a surge of validation, the comfort of knowing I wasn't just imagining the darkness I'd sensed, but what she said next sent a true chill down my spine, revealing a level of malice I hadn't been prepared for. And one more thing, dear, Eleanor said, her gaze turning serious. My new security camera, the one I put up over my garage, it catches a bit of your driveway. Last month, your front tire was flat. Remember you thought you'd run over a nail? I nodded, recalling the inconvenience. It wasn't a nail, she said grimly. My camera caught Juliet out there late one night. She knelt down and slashed it with a small knife. I heard her on the phone with Ethan right after, telling him you were getting too independent driving yourself around and that this would remind you of your limitations. The cruelty of it, the petty calculated act of sabotage, took my breath away. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control, about keeping me small and helpless, a prisoner in my own life. Eleanor saw the horror on my face and reached into her purse, pulling out a small black USB drive. She pressed it firmly into my palm. The video is on here, she said, her voice a low, steady promise of retribution. I thought you might need it someday. The war had just become even dirtier. For my deposition, I wore my plainest cardigan and a practiced look of confusion. The USB drive from Eleanor, a tiny black rectangle containing Juliet's calculated malice, was safely with my lawyer. Now it was time to play my part. I was about to give the performance of my life. And my audience had no idea they were watching a predator disguised as prey. The setting was a sterile conference room in a downtown law office, a place devoid of warmth or character. The air conditioning hummed loudly, a monotonous drone that matched the clinical hostility in the room. Ethan and Juliet sat across the long, polished table, their expressions a mixture of overconfidence and condescension. Their lawyer, a smarmy man named Mr. Finch, with a smile that never reached his eyes, radiated patronizing authority. Victoria, my counsel, sat beside me, a silent, observant presence. Let them commit perjury, Victoria had advised during our final strategy session. I clutched the small recording device in my pocket, a tiny, reassuring weight. It was my reminder of her words, my secret weapon for the day. Mr. Finch began, his voice smooth and condescending. Mrs. Hughes, thank you for coming. We're just here to get a clearer picture of your daily routines. Can you tell me what you had for breakfast this morning? I looked at him with wide, slightly unfocused eyes. Breakfast, I repeated, as if the concept were foreign. Oh dear, I believe it was toast? Yes, I think so. Arthur might remember. Juliet shot a triumphant look at Ethan. It was working. Finch continued, his questions a carefully constructed net designed to ensnare me. And your finances, Mrs. Hughes. Do you handle your own bill payments? I feigned a moment of panic. Oh my, it all gets so complicated. The numbers, they swim around. Michael always handled those things. Since he's been gone, I let my voice trail off, a picture of helpless grief. I deliberately forgot the name of my bank, confused the due dates for my utilities, and acted as if the concept of a 401k was a complex scientific theory. With every fumbled answer, I could see Juliet's smirk grow wider, Finch's condescending nods more pronounced. They were swallowing the bait whole. During a break, as they all filed out for coffee, I made a show of fumbling with my purse, accidentally leaving my phone on the table with the voice recorder app silently running. From the hallway, I could hear their hushed, confident voices drift back. I didn't have to wait long. When we returned, I retrieved my phone, my hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The final part of the deposition was a blur of more patronizing questions and my own carefully crafted, confused responses. The climax of their interrogation came when Mr. Finch leaned forward, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Mrs. Hughes," he asked, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "do you even know the current value of your late husband's primary company, Sterling Tech Inc.?" This was the moment, the linchpin of their entire case. I looked at him with the wide, innocent eyes of a woman completely out of her depth. "Oh, I have no idea," I said, my voice soft and airy. "Michael never bothered me with those things." The look of absolute victory that passed between Juliet and her lawyer was a thing of grotesque beauty. They believed they had won. They had no idea they had just sealed their own fate. Back home, in the comforting silence of my study, I put in my earbuds and listened to the recording from the conference room. Juliet's confident, cruel voice was crystal clear. "She's crumbling," she had whispered to Ethan. "The judge will take one look at her and hand everything over to us. She can't even remember what she ate for breakfast." Her triumphant laughter that followed was the last piece of evidence I needed. The trap was set. The phone call came from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew the voice instantly. Dr. Albright, the psychiatrist my children had hired to destroy me. In the wake of the deposition, a quiet confidence had begun to take root within me. Juliet's gloating, captured on my phone's recorder, was a potent reminder that their arrogance was my greatest weapon. I was in my study organizing Michael's old architectural drawings when the unfamiliar number flashed on my screen. I almost ignored it, but some instinct honed by weeks of living on high alert told me to answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice carefully pitched to sound hesitant, frail. "Mrs. Hughes, this is Dr. Robert Albright." His voice was smooth, polished, and oozed a kind of professional sincerity that I now knew was a well-rehearsed facade. The name from Juliet's note and the court filing was now speaking directly into my ear. He was a real person, a key player in their strategy, and he was about to make a fatal error. "Doctor?" I feigned confusion. I don't understand why you're calling me." "I apologize for the direct approach, Mrs. Hughes," he said, his tone oozing reason. "But after reviewing the preliminary notes for your case, I felt a responsibility to reach out. I'd like to conduct a brief, informal assessment before the hearing, just to get a sense of things myself." It would be entirely off the record, of course. A massive breach of ethics. Victoria's warning bells went off in my head. He was trying to get to me without my lawyer present, to trap me, to gather his own ammunition. Remembering my lawyer's advice, my thumb moved silently across my phone's screen, pressing the red record button. "Oh, I see," I said, allowing a tremor into my voice. "I'm not sure. My lawyer, Miss Sterling, she told me not to speak to anyone." I played my role perfectly, becoming the confused, easily led woman they believed me to be. "Victoria Sterling is an excellent attorney," he said smoothly, "but she is an advocate, not a clinician. My only concern is your well-being, Mrs. Hughes. This process can be so stressful, Sometimes a quiet chat can clear the air far better than a contentious court hearing. I was silent for a moment, letting him think he was winning me over. Well, what did you want to ask? He then proceeded to subtly offer me a deal, a poisoned olive branch. He spoke of the unpredictability of court, the emotional toll it would take on a woman in my delicate condition. He painted a grim picture of a protracted legal battle that would drain my spirit and my finances. Then he pivoted. "Your children," he said, his voice softening. "They've expressed to me that should the court grant them conservatorship, they have identified a very comfortable, high-end facility for you, a lovely place with gardens and excellent care. A far better outcome, frankly, than what can sometimes happen when these things are left to the state." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Cooperate or risk being thrown into a state-run nightmare. He was trying to scare me into submission. I let out a small, shaky sigh into the receiver. "So, you're saying it's better for me to just agree that I'm incompetent?" His reply was smooth as silk. The words of a man so confident in his power that he didn't realize he was handing me the noose to hang him with. "In cases like this, Mrs. Hughes," he said, his voice dropping conspiratorially, "cooperation is always the most lucrative path for everyone involved." The word hung in the air between us. Lucrative. He had just admitted on a recorded line that this was about money. He had just confirmed the entire conspiracy. I held my breath, waiting for him to say more, but he had already said more than enough. I have to think about that, doctor," I stammered, ending the call. I immediately stopped the recording and saved the file. My hands were perfectly steady. I sent the audio file to Victoria with a simple 3-word message. "I believe this is what you call checkmate." The day before the trial, Juliet sent me a box of my favorite chocolates with a note that read, "Thinking of you, Mom." The condescension was so thick I could taste it over the bittersweet dark chocolate. This pathetic attempt at manipulation, coming so soon after Dr. Albright's disastrous and recorded phone call, was almost laughable. It was a final, desperate play from an opponent who knew she was cornered but was too arrogant to admit it. I left the box on the kitchen counter, untouched. I had lost my appetite for their brand of poison. That evening, a fierce autumn storm rolled in, the wind howling around the eaves of the house and rain lashing against the window panes. It felt appropriate, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that was about to be unleashed in the courtroom. Arthur had flown back in from Florida, his presence a silent, unwavering pillar of support. "We're going to war," he had said on the phone weeks ago, and now, as I laid out my conservative black suit for court, I knew tomorrow was the final battle. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation, only the grim execution of a plan Michael had set in motion years ago. We had a quiet dinner, just the two of us at the large dining room table that had once been the stage for so much family drama. We didn't talk about the trial. Instead, Arthur brought out an old photo album, and we spent an hour reminiscing about Michael. We looked at faded pictures of him as a lanky teenager, a proud young father holding a baby Ethan, a successful man at the peak of his career. It was a necessary ritual, a way of grounding ourselves in the love that started all of this. A reminder of the man whose legacy we were fighting to protect from his own son's greed. "He would be so proud of you, Jess," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at a photo of Michael and me on our wedding day. "He always knew you were the strong one." Just as we were clearing the plates, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Ethan's name. My heart gave a painful lurch, a ghost of the maternal instinct I was trying so hard to suppress. I looked at Arthur, who simply nodded. I answered, my voice a neutral, steady calm. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was thin, nervous. I just wanted to call." "Why are you calling, Ethan?" I asked. No warmth in my tone. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he stammered, the words rushing out. "It's not too late to just agree. We could work something out. You don't have to listen to Victoria. She doesn't care about our family. It was a weak, pathetic attempt to get me to back down, born of fear, not remorse. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was terrified of the consequences he now knew were coming. "The time for working things out is over, Ethan," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the rain against the glass. "You made your choice on Thanksgiving. You made it again when you filed that petition. My only choice now is to see this through." There was a long silence on his end, filled only with the sound of his ragged breathing. Then, with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut on a lifetime of memories, I said, "I will see you in court, Ethan." I hung up before he could reply, severing the last frayed thread that connected us. Later that night, I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, my black suit laid out on the bed. I looked at my reflection, at the lines on my face etched by grief and worry, at the silver streaks in my hair. For months I had seen a victim staring back at me, a frail, confused woman they had tried to create. But tonight, I saw someone else. I saw a woman who had been underestimated, a woman who had mourned, a woman who had been pushed to the brink. But I also saw a woman who was still standing, a woman who was calm, centered, and ready. I smoothed down the lapels of my suit jacket, a silent gesture of armoring up. I picked up the legacy box from my desk, its weight both a burden and a source of immense strength. Arthur was waiting for me in the foyer. He simply nodded, his eyes saying everything that words could not. I walked out the front door with him by my side, not looking back. It was time. The courtroom was colder than a tomb, and as I watched Ethan and Juliet take their seats at the plaintiff's table, I saw them not as my children, but as the architects of my near burial. The quiet resolve I had felt leaving my house that morning was now a knot of ice in my stomach. This was it, the final battleground. The air in the Connecticut Superior Courtroom was heavy and tense, smelling of old wood polish and anxiety. The gallery was sparsely populated. A few of Juliet's distant relatives sat on one side, whispering amongst themselves, while on my side, Arthur sat stoically, his presence a silent mountain of support. Beside him was Mrs. Gable, who gave me a small, determined nod. At the head of the room sat Judge Carol Esposito, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and a low tolerance for theatrics, something my lawyer was counting on. Her sharp eyes swept the room, missing nothing. Mr. Finch, their lawyer, began his opening statement. His voice filled the room, a smooth, practiced baritone designed to inspire trust and pity. He painted a masterful picture of a beloved family matriarch tragically declining into senility. He spoke of my understandable confusion following my husband's death, my increasing paranoia, and my erratic financial decisions. He portrayed Ethan and Juliet not as greedy predators, but as devoted children making a heartbreakingly difficult choice to protect their mother from herself and her fortune from opportunistic vultures. It was a disgusting, brilliant performance. He called his first witness Juliet. She walked to the stand, a vision of sorrowful elegance in a conservative navy blue dress. She clutched a handkerchief in her hand and gave the jury a watery, pleading look. Her performance was Oscar-worthy. She spoke of my forgetfulness, fabricating a story about me leaving the stove on all night. She recounted my erratic behavior, describing with tearful detail how I had accused her of stealing jewelry that she had simply put away for safekeeping. She perjured herself repeatedly, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, painting a portrait of a woman lost in the fog of dementia. "All we want is to ensure she's safe," she concluded, dabbing her eyes with the handkerchief. "It's what Michael would have wanted." Next, Mr. Finch called Ethan to the stand. My son looked pale and uncomfortable. He couldn't bring himself to look at me, his gaze fixed on his hands as he twisted his wedding ring. He mumbled his way through his testimony, uncomfortably backing up his wife's lies. "Yes," he confirmed. "Mom has been different lately. Confused." "And you're concerned for her well-being?" Finch prompted. "Of course," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. "She's my mother." He sounded like a man reading a script he despised, but was too cowardly to discard. The climax of their case came when Mr. Finch called their final witness. The plaintiff calls Dr. Robert Albright. Dr. Albright took the stand with an air of unimpeachable authority. He spoke in calm, clinical terms, referencing his informal assessment and the deeply concerned reports from the family. He testified with great professional gravity that, based on the pattern of behavior described to him, it was his expert opinion that I was exhibiting clear signs of cognitive decline and was no longer competent to manage my own complex financial affairs. He recommended immediate, court-appointed supervision for my own protection. It was a masterful, damning performance, and I could feel the jury's sympathetic gaze shift towards my children. They had built their mountain of lies, and it was a formidable one. Mr. Finch sat down, a smug, satisfied look on his face. "The plaintiff rests, Your Honor." The room was silent, the weight of their accusations hanging in the air. Judge Esposito looked at my lawyer. "Miss Sterling?" Victoria stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked to the center of the courtroom, the silence following her. "No questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. She then turned, her gaze sweeping past Juliet, past Ethan, and landing squarely on me. The defense would now like to call its first witness, Mrs. Jessica Hughes. Every head in the courtroom turned, a murmur rippled through the gallery. Juliet's confident smirk faltered for the first time. It was my turn. The performance was over. I walked to the witness stand, feeling not the weight of my 70 years, but the strength of the truth I was about to unleash. Each step on the worn marble floor of the courtroom was deliberate. My simple black suit a suit of armor. The legacy box now resting on the defense table like a sleeping dragon. The room was dead silent, every eye fixed on me. I could feel Ethan's panicked stare, Juliet's contemptuous glare, and the jury's curious, pitying gaze. They all saw a frail old woman being led to the slaughter. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I settled into the witness chair, the wood hard and unyielding against my back. I adjusted the microphone, my hands perfectly steady. Across the room, I saw the words I had whispered to Arthur in the safety of my dining room, shimmering in the air, waiting to be spoken aloud. I own everything. Today, those words would become a public declaration, an unshakable fact. Victoria approached, her expression calm and methodical. She began with a series of simple questions, her voice a clear, confident counterpoint to the lies that had filled the room just moments before. "Please state your full name for the record." "Jessica Ann Hughes." My voice was clear, without a trace of the feigned confusion from the deposition. "And your address?" I recited it perfectly, along with the zip code. "Mrs. Hughes, can you tell the court what you did for a living before you retired?" "For 25 years, I was the head bookkeeper for a mid-sized manufacturing firm," I stated. "I managed payroll, accounts receivable, and quarterly tax filings. Before that, I earned my degree in accounting from Boston University." A small, surprised murmur rippled through the jury box. This was not the portrait of a woman who found numbers swimming around. I saw Mr. Finch, their lawyer, shift uncomfortably at his table. Victoria let the information settle before moving on. "Mrs. Hughes, the plaintiffs have filed this petition out of a stated concern for your ability to manage your late husband's estate. Can you please tell the court what that estate primarily consists of?" I took a deep breath, letting my gaze drift past the judge, past the jury, and landing squarely on my son. My husband, Michael Hughes, was the founder and, until his death, the CEO of a privately held technology firm. I paused. letting the weight of the formal title sink in. The company is called Sterling Tech Inc. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Juliet lean over and whisper something to Ethan, a confident smirk playing on her lips. They thought this was my final pathetic attempt to sound important. They had no idea. Victoria's next question was the key that would unlock everything. "And who," she asked, her voice ringing with purpose, "is the current owner of Sterling Tech Inc.?" I turned my head slowly, first looking at Judge Esposito with the utmost respect. Then I turned and locked eyes with my son, Ethan. I held his gaze, forcing him to see the mother he had betrayed, the woman he had tried to erase. And then, in a voice that was perfectly calm, clear, and powerful, I answered, "I am, and I have been for the last 5 years." The silence in the courtroom was absolute, a perfect vacuum. Then Mr. Finch shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, the witness is confused, she's delusional." Juliet let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. But Ethan just stared at me, the color draining from his face as a dawning, horrifying comprehension began to flicker in his eyes. Victoria remained perfectly still. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I would like to present into evidence Defense Exhibit A." She walked to our table, retrieved a thick, leather-bound portfolio from Arthur, and placed it before the court clerk. "This is the certified deed of transfer and the original state-registered stock certificates for 100% of the shares of Sterling Tech Inc., transferred to the sole ownership of Mrs. Jessica Hughes on May 14th, 2020. The judge took the documents, her expression unreadable. Mr. Finch continued to sputter. "This is a trick! Forgery! It's impossible!" Judge Esposito held up a hand, silencing him instantly. She examined the documents for a long, agonizing minute, her sharp eyes scanning every line, every signature, every official seal. I could see her eyebrows raise, just slightly. Finally, she looked up, her gaze like granite, and fixed it on Mr. Finch. "These documents appear to be in perfect legal order," she stated, her voice cutting through the tension. She overruled the objection with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Mr. Finch, it seems your entire petition is predicated on a false assumption." Juliet let out an audible gasp, a strangled, choking sound of pure shock. Ethan looked like he'd seen a ghost, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of utter disbelief. The legal foundation of their entire world had just been obliterated. Victoria turned back to her notes at the defense table, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She looked up at the judge and said, "Your Honor, we are just getting started." If the deed was the earthquake that shattered their case, the evidence that followed was the tsunami that washed away their lives. The courtroom was no longer tense. The atmosphere had shifted to one of shock and morbid fascination. Juliet sat as if turned to stone, her face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. Ethan was visibly trembling, his gaze darting between me, the judge, and his now useless lawyer, a cornered animal realizing there was no escape. Every seed of proof that Michael, Arthur, and I had planted throughout this painful journey was now ready to be harvested. Victoria allowed the impact of the deed to settle for a moment before she turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would now like to present Exhibit B." She nodded to the clerk, and a moment later, Juliet's own voice filled the courtroom, captured from the deposition break. "She's crumbling!" Her recorded voice gloated, sharp and cruel. "The judge will take one look at her and hand everything over to us. She can't even remember what she ate for breakfast." A wave of quiet gasps went through the gallery. I saw Mrs. Gable shake her head in disgust. Judge Esposito's eyes, cold and sharp, moved from the court reporter transcribing the words and settled on Juliet with a glare so intense it seemed to burn. Juliet shrank in her seat, her face turning a blotchy, panicked red. "Next," Victoria continued, her voice relentless, We present Exhibit C, the report from the private investigator hired by the late Mr. Michael Hughes. She laid out the damning summary of Ethan's finances, the casino debts, the high-interest loans, the maxed-out credit cards. She followed it with an affidavit from Mrs. Gable, complete with the loan shark's license plate number. "The plaintiffs did not act out of concern, Your Honor," Victoria stated, her voice ringing with conviction. "They acted out of pure, suffocating financial desperation." But she was far from finished. "And now, Your Honor, Exhibit D." She played the recording of my phone call with Dr. Albright. His smooth, professional voice filled the room as he offered me a place in a high-end facility and spoke of cooperation. Then came the final, fatal words. "In cases like this, cooperation is always the most lucrative path for everyone involved." Judge Esposito's face was a thundercloud. She looked at Dr. Albright, who was sitting in the gallery, and then at the bailiff. "Bailiff," she ordered, her voice like cracking ice, "take Dr. Albright into a holding room. He is to be questioned regarding conspiracy and medical ethics violations. Inform the State Medical Board that a transcript of this recording is forthcoming." The sight of the disgraced psychiatrist being led out of the courtroom was a stunning, immediate consequence that left Ethan and Juliet looking utterly terrified. Finally, Victoria called her last witness. The defense calls Mr. Arthur Hughes to the stand. Arthur walked to the stand, his expression grim and sad. In his hand, he held the cream-colored envelope from the legacy box. Victoria asked him only one question. "Mr. Hughes, can you please read the letter your brother, Michael Hughes, left for his wife?" Arthur cleared his throat, and in a steady, solemn voice, he read Michael's last words into the court record. He read of Michael's undying love for me, his pride in the life we built. Then came the painful part. "I have watched our son lose his way," Arthur read, his own voice cracking. "He has a hole in his soul that no amount of money can fill, and he has chosen a partner who encourages his worst instincts. I fear they will see you not as a mother, but as an obstacle to their desires. This is my firewall, Jess, my last act of love to protect you from our son's weakness." The raw, heartbreaking honesty of my husband's words silenced the entire room. I looked at Ethan. He had his head in his hands, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. For the first time, I think he truly understood the father he had lost and the man he had failed to become. When Arthur finished, Judge Esposito took a long, deep breath. She looked at Ethan and Juliet, her eyes filled with a cold, righteous fury. "This court," she began, her voice resonating with absolute power, "finds the petition for conservatorship to be frivolous, malicious, and predicated on a foundation of fraud. This case is dismissed with extreme prejudice." She slammed her gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. But she wasn't done. She turned her gaze to the assistant district attorney sitting in the front row. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice cutting, "I believe the state will be very interested in pursuing charges of perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted elder abuse against Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Hughes." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was in that moment that Ethan's body went limp, and he slumped forward in his chair, fainting dead away. Juliet just sat there, staring into space, her face a blank mask, completely catatonic. The war was over. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than I had in years. The weight of the impending battle, the dread of public humiliation, the sheer emotional exhaustion of it all seemed to evaporate in the crisp Connecticut air. I had lost a son in that cold, sterile room, but I had regained myself. Arthur was on one side of me, his hand a steady presence on my elbow, and Mrs. Gable was on the other, her eyes shining with fierce pride. The war was over, and a profound, if somber, peace began to settle over me. As we descended the wide marble steps, a small cluster of local reporters approached, microphones extended. Victoria had prepped me for this. "Mrs. Hughes, can you comment on the verdict?" one of them asked. I paused, thinking of Michael's wish for me to be protected. His intricate, painful plan had worked more perfectly than he ever could have imagined. It hadn't just saved me, it had exposed a darkness that needed to be brought into the light. Today, justice was served, I said, my voice clear and steady. But this was never just about me. My hope is that this outcome serves as a warning to those who would prey on the vulnerability of their elders. Dignity has no age limit, and the law, when wielded with truth, will protect it. I kept my statement brief and dignified, then allowed Arthur and Mrs. Gable to steer me toward the waiting car, leaving the questions and flashing cameras behind. Back at my house, the silence that greeted us was different. It was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken silence of the weeks after Michael's death, nor the tense, watchful silence of the battle. It was a clean, peaceful silence, the sound of a home that was finally, truly, mine again. Mrs. Gable insisted on making us a simple lunch, chicken soup and fresh bread, and the three of us sat around my kitchen table, a stark contrast to the performative family dinners of the past. This was a meal built on loyalty and shared truth, not manipulation. Later that afternoon, after Eleanor had gone home and Arthur was quietly reading in the study, the phone rang. It was the chairman of the board of Sterling Tech. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound respect, "the board has been made aware of the court's ruling. We formally recognize you as the sole owner and controlling shareholder. We would be honored to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss the future of the company." The words felt surreal. For so long, I had been Jessica, the grieving widow, the confused mother. Now I was the sole owner, a woman of power and consequence. It was a role Michael had prepared for me, one I now had to learn to inhabit. That evening, I went into Michael's study. The room was just as he'd left it, a testament to a life of order and quiet brilliance. I sat down at his heavy mahogany desk, the worn leather of his chair cool against my skin. I thought of Ethan, of the boy I had loved, and the man he had become. The path to this moment had been paved with his betrayal, but my path forward had to be one of clear-eyed consequence. I opened the center drawer and took out a fresh piece of heavy, cream-colored stationery, the kind Michael had used for his most important correspondence. With a steady hand, I began to write a new will, starting with a clear, unequivocal clause that formally and irrevocably disinherited my only son. As I was signing my name at the bottom of the first page, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, then answered, a sense of finality settling over me. The voice on the other end was a choked, terrified sob. It was Juliet calling from the police station. "Please, Jessica, you can't do this to us," she wailed, her voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "They're talking about criminal charges. Prison, please." I listened for a moment to the sound of her world collapsing, the world she had built on a foundation of lies. Then, without a word, I quietly ended the call. A year later, I stood on the balcony of the new wing of the local children's hospital, a plaque bearing my husband's name gleaming on the wall beside me, and I finally understood the true meaning of his fortune. The chaos of the courtroom, the sting of betrayal, the raw agony of a fractured family, all of it had receded, replaced by the gentle murmur of a crowd gathered for a purpose greater than any one person's pain. The crisp autumn air felt clean, hopeful, a world away from the suffocating atmosphere of the trial. I had taken control of Sterling Tech, not with an iron fist, but with a quiet, steady hand that the board, initially wary, had come to respect. My first act as sole owner was not to liquidate or to sell, but to create. I established the Michael Hughes Foundation for Children's Health, dedicating a significant portion of the company's annual profits to funding pediatric care and research. This new wing, a state-of-the-art facility for children with rare diseases, was its first great achievement. As I stepped up to the podium to give a short speech, I thought of Michael's final wish, the mission he had entrusted to me from beyond the grave. Use this power wisely, not to hurt, but to protect and to teach. His words had become my life's mission. My late husband believed that true wealth is not measured by what you accumulate, I said, my voice carrying over the hushed crowd, but by what you contribute. He built a firewall to protect me, but in doing so, he gave me the tools to build a bridge from our family's private pain to our community's public hope. After the ceremony, Arthur joined me on the balcony, and we looked out over the city. "He would be so proud, Jess," he said, his voice thick with a quiet emotion. We didn't speak of Ethan or Juliet often, but the knowledge of their fate was a silent undercurrent to our new reality. They had avoided jail time, their high-priced lawyers managing to negotiate a plea deal that involved hefty fines, 2 years of probation, and hundreds of hours of community service. The public humiliation, however, had been a sentence of its own. They had divorced within 6 months of the trial. Juliet, I had heard through the grapevine, had moved out of state, disappearing into a new life of obscurity, her reputation in Connecticut utterly destroyed. Ethan was a different story. Stripped of his unearned wealth and social standing, he was working a low-wage job in a neighboring state, humbled and broken. The criminal record for fraud and perjury was a permanent stain, a constant reminder of the price of his greed. He was living the life he had so desperately tried to avoid, a life of consequence. The final scene of my story did not play out in a courtroom or a boardroom, but right here, in my own garden. A few weeks after the hospital dedication, I was tending to Michael's favorite roses, their deep crimson petals a vibrant testament to life's ability to bloom even after the harshest winter. Arthur joined me, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. We sat on the bench Michael had built, talking about the foundation's future plans. I was no longer just a widow or a victim. I was a philanthropist, a leader, a protector of my husband's true legacy. It was then that Arthur handed me a letter. "This came in the mail today," he said gently. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Ethan's. My heart gave a familiar, painful squeeze. I hadn't heard from him in almost a year. I opened it, my hand steady. The note inside was shockingly brief, written on a simple, plain piece of paper. It didn't ask for money. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't make excuses. It simply said, "Mom, I was wrong. I am sorry." I read the 2 simple sentences over and over. It was the first genuine apology I had ever received from him, an acknowledgement of his wrongdoing stripped of all manipulation. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped my eye and fell onto the page, blurring the ink. I didn't reply to the letter. Some wounds were too deep to be healed with just words. But as I folded the note and put it in my pocket, a look of complex peace settled over me. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in a very long time, it was entirely and peacefully mine to decide. Looking out at the sunrise from my porch, seeing the light touch the roses in my garden, I no longer thought about what I had lost, but about what I had finally reclaimed, my own freedom. Justice didn't just give me back my life, it gave me a new purpose. I learned that the greatest victory isn't revenge, but the quiet work of rebuilding your dignity and turning that pain into a source of strength for others. The peace I feel now, with the simple smell of morning coffee filling my home, is the real inheritance. Have you ever transformed a painful experience into your greatest strength? I would love to connect with you in the comments.